series, and I'm your host, David Harrison. Throughout this series, we'll take a candid look through the lenses of culturally diverse technology leaders to discuss their rise through the glass ceiling and what happens immediately after the glass breaks. Today's guest is Suresh Raj, Global Chief Growth Officer for Virtue. Suresh, welcome to the ride.
Thank you so much, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, my friend. Good to see you again. Excited
Likewise.
to have you here. Everything above table. Suresh and I have spoken a couple times, and I guarantee this is one of the stories that you're going to love to hear, and we'll be very attuned to what we're trying to establish on this podcast, which is they can't be what they can't see. So, Suresh, we want to take the audience on a journey, right? We want them to walk in your shoes, understand who you are, understand some of your struggles and your triumphs and things you saw throughout your life cycle and where you are today. So with that journey, we always got to start at the beginning, right? So Suresh, tell us where you grew up.
Well, first of all, David, thank you so much for having me, inviting me on this. I'm so honored, and it's such a privilege to actually share this moment actually with all the listeners. So thank you again. I actually probably pride myself on the fact that I've lived and I was brought up and have lived in multiple places around the world. So I was born and brought up in Asia, lived about half my life over there, half the rest of my life in Europe, and the last 7 years and a bit in North America. So to drill it down a little bit more, I was born and brought up in Malaysia, which is, in the peninsula of Southeast Asia, and to a very, very mixed parentage. So ethnically, I'm incredibly mixed. I'm pure mutt. So on my mum's side, I'm half local Malay, half Arab. And on my dad's side, I'm half Indian. I've got an Indian name because of my paternal grandfather, but my grandmother on my father's side is Palestinian Jew. So there's a mix of Malay, Arab, Indian, and Palestinian Jew. And frankly, the Arab and the Jew mix in my family makes me walk in world peace, I feel, and literally because if I'm at peace with myself, the rest of the world should be. But it was a strange dynamic because I was born in the early 70s, and even in those days, mixed marriages were so uncommon.
Right.
And Malaysia is a multicultural country. It's the three dominant races are the Malays, the Chinese, and the Indians, and for all intents and purposes in the society, the Malays married the Malays, the Chinese, stayed in their lane and married Chinese, and the Indians did exactly the same, but very harmoniously. They lived harmoniously in society. But what was interesting is being of mixed marriage and coming from that mixed culture, I was an anomaly. Being an anomaly of a mixed marriage in a society that's multicultural is a weird dynamic, right? So it probably wouldn't feel weird if you came from a society that was fairly monochrome, but you ended up being a mix somewhere else, and then you can feel that you stand out. But when you stand out when there is a mixed cultural environment that you've growing up with, that's a very weird feeling. So the upshot of it is being a child of that, product of that marriage. Both sides of the family, so both sides of mum and dad's families, just didn't accept us. They didn't accept the marriage, and so we were seen as tainted, tainted blood, tainted mix, and so we were disowned by both sides of the family. So,
Wow.
And I don't say this to seek any sympathy, because you cannot miss what you've never had. And if you were to ask me what experiences of having aunts, uncles, grandparents, extended family, I have no idea what that feeling is, because I've never had that. And I don't miss it because I've never had it. And nostalgically, when I think about it, it would be so lovely if I had it. But I can't contextualize that because there's no frame of reference. But that was what I knew. So I was born into an immediate family that the environment was just like that, and we were a fairly close-knit family, mum and dad, and I've got an older sister and a younger brother, and that's what we knew. And so the family friends became my parents had lots of close friends, and the family friends became family. We would spend Christmases together, and it was interesting that the closest family that we were sort of really attached to was a mixed marriage family as well. So they
Mm.
were, the father was Indian, the mother was Chinese, and so the children were of mixed marriage as well. So we were particularly close. So every Christmas we spent it together like we were cousins, and that's what we knew. So it was like ostracized from different parts of the community because we were seen as strange and different. We didn't stay within our lanes, but everybody was fairly pleasant. But added to this conundrum, and there are two other sort of dichotomies to add to the mix. So being the mixed culture is one point, and being ostracized for that. But I was born into a family that was originally Muslim. So in
Mm.
Malaysia, it's a Muslim country, and my mother was Muslim, and the law of the nation is Malays and who are Muslims have to remain Muslim. It's a statutory law. And so when my dad got married to my mum, he had to convert from Christianity to Islam to marry her in order for it to be legal in the eyes of the law and
Wow.
the government. And so they were Muslim for a number of years, but of his own accord, he didn't believe in the faith and he decided to convert back to Christianity, which he did. And then a few years later, on her own accord, my mother converted from Islam to Christianity, which in Malaysia, being a Muslim country, is considered apostasy. So it is potentially punishable by
Wow.
death. And growing up in that environment, so being mixed culture, and then I have a Muslim mother who converted to Christianity, which meant all of us became Christians as a result. And to become a Christian, she had to leave the country. So they moved to Singapore to renounce the religion and create had to do an official statutory declaration to renounce Islam to become Christian. And we were considered, and as we got on with our lives, our family was considered an internal security threat. So there was a official
Wow.
government body called the Internal Security Act, ISA, that basically monitored the families that were considered anomalies and potential threats to society. So the Muslim society is the dominant society, and it's the official religion and the faith, etc., of the nation. And I want to be very clear that I'm not pointing fingers, because the Malays, the Muslims are, and every culture are lovely people. They're
Correct.
harmonious, simple, lovely people. This is much more around the institution of religion, the institution of government forcing things down, society, and we were living under that shadow. And and so our family was considered a national threat, and there were 56 families at that point of my upbringing that were considered a national threat, because all 56 of the families had a Muslim heritage but converted out of Islam to another
Interesting.
religion. And as you know, the dynamics between Islam and Christianity, I
Mm.
mean, well, what am I to say? A nearly 50-year-old guy talking about this, but this has been going on for thousands of years, right?
Right.
And so as a result of that, the challenge of religion added to the cultural sort of anomaly, we were a real ostracized family in so many ways. So we the way I would describe it is it was silent genocide. And so they didn't come to
Mm.
flog us in public, or they didn't hang us, or they didn't shoot us, but they made our lives difficult to live a normal life. So access to education was difficult, access to jobs was difficult. And my father constantly, he was a government officer. We were very simple people. My father was a government officer in the Internal Revenue Service, and my mother was a housewife. And we were not rich by any means at all. In fact, my
Right.
dad had his car for over 35 years, and it was falling apart. But that's the life we lived, right? And so we were constantly being moved about and tested as a family because of government protocols and religious challenges, etc. And it was difficult to live in that environment and not feel like you could connect to your friends or peers, because there were very few of us who can actually
Right.
come from that walk of life. And despite that, I think my parents did a wonderful job in giving us a happy life, because we were fairly sheltered from that, from the the ostracism and the way we were treated, because they never talked to us about our background. And the only reason I gave you the background on my heritage is I actually found out about it about a month before both parents passed away,
Oh,
respectively,
sorry to hear that.
because
Yeah.
they kept that story to themselves. So we never bothered to ask, and frankly, we didn't need to ask because we were happy as a family unit. So in that whole time we were being brought up, I never looked at my parents in a strange way, like, "Oh, you guys are different. Other families are not different," and like, why we are a different culture, why we've got this like they never talked about it. So we never knew about all of this. We only knew because we were young. We kind of knew the environment we were brought up in. And then as I grew up, and from the earliest of memories, I remember being attracted, and I use the word attracted very, very loosely because it was not even a term I understood, to be honest. I knew I had an affinity towards the male individual.
Right.
There was no, I didn't know if it's a sexual attraction. I didn't know if it was an affinity. I don't know what it was. I couldn't put a word on it. But it was also, as a result of my upbringing, incredibly religious. We were churchgoers, and we would go to church every day, and I was in the youth worship team, and I was in the um, song lead in church, and youth workshops, etc. So very, very active. But at the same time, in me, I was developing this thing where I didn't understand the feeling of being attracted to the same sex. And as far as I knew, my upbringing, everything in the Bible told me about what I was evil and wrong, and I'll be burning in hell, and I'll die. And so I'd go to church and have this amazing facade of loving God and loving my fellow community and blah blah blah, being this wonderful person. And again, zero reflection on the faith, because I am still a person of faith. That will never
Right.
be shaken. My challenge was the religious institution of what, you know, just the church represents. And so for me, the struggle was very real because I couldn't put into words the attraction, but I also realized that all that attraction was evil and wrong, and I'm going to burn in hell, etc. So this massive dichotomy in me, talking about the mixed culture, the mixed faith, and then the sexuality piece, and I couldn't piece that together. So what I did is I threw myself head on into religion. And I just became the best Christian that existed on this world because I felt that there was an evil sin that I was living, and it was a disease that I ultimately needed to be cured of.
Wow.
And so, I tried so much for faith and religion. I'll go for prayers, and whenever you go up, and the reverend would, the pastors would lay their hands on you to pray. I wouldn't say what the prayer is for. I just know I'm seeking prayer, and in me, in my mind, I'll be going, please pray the gay away. I don't want to be
Mm.
this evil person. I don't want to be sick. I don't want to have this disease. Pray it away. And it never did, never went away. And 49 years later, it still hasn't gone away. And so I'm thinking it's probably not a disease. It's
No, I don't
probably
think so.
who
I
I
don't think
am.
so.
Exactly. And and I was, I lived in Malaysia for the first 21 years of my life, maybe 22. I can't remember the exact date. And then I had this brilliant opportunity to move to England to study. And I took it, I grabbed it like a bull with both horns, and both hands rather. And I moved to the UK, and the first thing I did is at university is I found a church, because that's what you do. You find a safe haven. You go
Yeah.
and find a community you belong with. So I went and find a church, and I was great. I was doing really well in school and at the university, and I was studying hard. But I also had a wonderful group of friends, very active in church. I did the same thing. I became a worship leader, and I was, very, very active in all church activities. But I started to see a different society because I lived in London. And in London, in the early 90s, there's an LGBTQ movement. There are people who are
Yes.
openly
That is true.
LGBTQ. And I started, and again, being gay as far as I was concerned, Malaysia didn't exist. I was the only person because I didn't see anything in society. And I should contextualize even more before I talk about the experience in Western Europe. Was everything in Malaysia, being a Muslim country, was censored that had to do with emotions or sexuality, etc., right down to kissing. So when I give you the context of this story, I was about 4 years old, and I was watching Snow White, the Disney classic cartoon Snow White,
Yes.
right? And we're, a 4-year-old kid watching a cartoon, and you're enthralled by it. And for all my life, until my early 20s when I moved to England, I never knew how Snow White woke up. because, beg your pardon, it wasn't Snow White, Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah.
Because you see the moment she pricks her finger, she falls into a deep sleep, and then she kisses the prince and she wakes up and life is all happy, hunky-dory again. In Malaysia, being a Muslim country, the kiss was censored. The cartoon
Mm.
kiss was censored. So all those years, we just assumed, but she finally woke up. And
He slayed the
that is
dragon and she woke up.
exactly. He slayed the dragon and she woke up. And so the basic human act of kissing on a Disney cartoon was censored, let alone any access to other sorts of sexuality conversations, etc. Even today, in the last year or so, there's been public caning of people caught in lesbian acts, etc. So, the country's not moved on, but
Right.
that gives you the grounding in terms of the context that I was brought up in, like the basic Sleeping Beauty's kiss on a Disney cartoon was censored for a child. So I never saw people kiss in public. So for the very first time I saw a public kiss, I was actually in a double-decker bus turning the corner in Piccadilly Circus in London, and I saw a man and a woman kissing in public, and it was very romantic, and I thought the police were going to come and get them. So I was so surprised, I slammed my head against the glass of the double-decker bus because I'd never seen a kiss in public. Like, because you don't see
Wow.
kisses on TV, you don't see kisses on movies, etc. in Malaysia, because all of that is censored. So it really gives you a sense of the sort of the grounding of what I conceived to be relationships, etc. And I didn't know where babies came from right to my 16th and 17th birthday because no one talked about it. It was completely taboo. And next thing you know, like a woman comes and she's got a bump, and I go, "Wow, how did that happen? I have no idea. No one talks about it." Right? It is really, really shocking. And you think about that, and somebody who's brought up in that environment is thrown into a Western world
Western
where
culture, yeah.
everything's so much more open. And when I finally saw that people were living their life freely, being lesbian or gay or transgender and bisexual, and bear with, don't get me wrong, 1990s, it was hard to believe to say this, but it's over 30 something years ago. They still had a lot of challenges in terms of trying
Yes,
to
sir, they
improve
did.
themselves. But in London, in particular, at that point, it was well in advance to where I came from in Malaysia. So when I saw people were openly gay at university, there were gay men holding hands and kissing, and lesbians, etc. I'm thinking, oh my God, like how are they living so freely and no one's judging them? Of course, there were some people that did, but more or less they were certainly a lot freer than where I came from.
Right.
And it that piqued my interest, and like maybe there's a chance for me to be who I am. And yet I was still, there's this massive challenge within me and fight within me about, do I live to be free or do I live to who I'm supposed to be according to the Bible? And I ended up being in a relationship with a girl because I thought that's what I had to do. So I was in a relationship with a girl for about 4 years, maybe 5, I would say, and a lovely person. Like, we were both at church together, and it was all very hunky-dory and perfect. It was 3 days before my marriage, and we were engaged and we were about to get married, and I was dead inside because I'm thinking, I cannot go through this. And I cannot go through this because of my religious upbringing, because everything I know about what the Bible tells me to be is to be a person who's honorable and tells the truth, somebody who lives by my truth. And whilst everything on paper, her family, her loving me, her family loving me, my family loving her and loving her family, it was all, particularly if you going back to the beginning of my story, where my family were disowned by all the extended families. My parents were really keen that I married into a family that is welcoming, and so
Yeah.
that we extend and grow the family, which is what they've always wanted. And I was, if it was a tick box exercise, I was going down this tick box exercise and doing exactly what everybody wanted. The final box is, do you, Suresh, love her the way you should do? And no, the answer wasn't. I loved her as a human being, as a
Right.
friend, but I
But you
didn't. I
wasn't in
wasn't.
love.
I wasn't in love with her. I was trying to
Correct.
do the right thing. And
Yeah.
so this huge challenge and burden within me was, do I tell the truth and live my authentic truth and risk being isolated and being on my own and die of damnation, burning in hell because of who I am? Or do I pretend? and lie and do what everybody's telling me to do and what the Bible tells me to do. And I was so torn. When push came to shove 3 days before the wedding, and I just said, I have to tell the truth because that's what I
Mm,
believe God would want me to do. So she was the very first person I came out to. I took her for a long walk and I said, like, I'm really sorry. I cannot go through with this. And the truth is because I'm gay. And I've always been gay, and I've tried so hard to pray the gay away, but I cannot do it and I
right.
cannot change. And what breaks me the most is I'm perfectly fine. And I asked you whether I was allowed to swear at the beginning of
Right.
this podcast. I was, and I am going to swear. I'm perfectly fine fucking up my life, but I will not fuck somebody else's life up. That is just not the right thing to do. That's not part of my upbringing. It's not part of
Yeah.
my DNA, and I could not do that to anyone. So, assuming we had a happy marriage and 10 years in, temptation drags me away and something goes wrong and it's a destruction of a family, why would I do that to anyone? And my very core doesn't allow me to do that. So I told her the truth, and it was very, very painful for her. It was a very painful moment. um, but we tried, she insisted that it was just a phase I was going through, and we tried to still stay together, but it was definitely not working.
Right.
And I just secluded into myself. I was a very closed shell, and I went, well, that's it. This is my lot in life. I'll forever be gay, but I know it's evil, so I will never act on it. So therefore, I'll just be Suresh, the silent single man, all his life. And I tried to find happiness in that. At the same time, no one in my family knew, and I couldn't because they were very, very, from Islam to Christianity, they were staunch religious Christians.
Right.
Um, and it was very difficult. So I lived this very sheltered life, very quiet life. And what I did is I had to compensate, right? So you're suppressing all these emotions of being who I am and being your authentic self. I think that's the message I really want to land. I could not be my authentic self because I couldn't allow myself. Maybe society was open around me, but I couldn't because of everything that was in my head and my very being and my society, etc.
Yeah.
So I threw myself into my studies, excelled beyond belief. Like I became straight A's in my undergrad and my postgrad and my MBA. Got an amazing job, and I worked like no one else. Like I just doubled down on work and I delivered. I just want to be somebody who was focused on something that was positive in his life, and I felt career was it. So I just really,
Mhm.
really worked hard. And delivered against everything that was handed to me, and through that became my north star. So I progressed through my career fairly quickly, and started in the marketing communications industry. I was in my first company for 10 years, then moved to another one for 5 years, and so on and so forth. My career just progressed. But in this whole duration, I slowly came out to myself, accepted myself, but not openly out in society, or not broadly. So small
Right.
groups of friends knew, and I slowly started to come my own, but my family never knew. In particular, my mother, because I was a bit of a mother's boy, and she, while I broke her heart for not marrying my ex-fiance and giving
Right.
her the dream and the image she wanted, um, she knew that I was, I had my own walk in life and I was ready to be single, and that's what I wanted to pursue. And I became successful in my career, and that progress. So she saw at least there was an element of me that seemed happy because my career is progressing, and being very Asian as families are, as you know, if you're not a lawyer, doctor, engineer, or in that walk of life, it's all about the success,
It's
right? The
all about
success
the
factor of your
success.
child.
Correct.
Exactly. My child is successful, and they love bragging about that, and parental bragging rights. And so they were very proud of me and the success I was achieving. But I was dying inside because I was incredibly lonely, and I couldn't pursue who I was. Um, and so over time, I realized that actually maybe I could start a relationship, and I did. I ended up having a relationship with a man, and we were together for over 10 years. And in that time, I really started to know who I was, but our friends were all straight couples. So we didn't hang around in the gay community. Our friends were all very close friends, all part of sort of a straight community. And I was fine, was perfectly happy with that. But I was still not free because I couldn't be myself. And so
Right.
whenever I was with family, my partner at that point was my housemate. We literally slept, we had separate bedrooms, etc. And we lived that life, right, of
Yeah.
pretense in so many ways for 10 years, 10, 11 years actually. And in that period, my mother ends up, and so this is going into sort of the early 2000s up to about 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, my mother contracted cancer. It was the second time around. It came back. And in 2008, she died of breast cancer. And
Sorry to hear that.
she died, thank you. And she died 2 days before Christmas. And I remember that because I was the only child with her, and she was in England at that point. I was the only child with her, and I was holding her hand as she released her last breath. And I realized that my mother had died not knowing her
Not
son.
knowing. Yeah. Yeah.
She may have had, and I think all mothers do, they have an inclination,
It's
but
an
I,
inclination that she's
yeah,
got a feeling that there's something here, but I don't know what it is, and I'm not gonna probe and pride and get into his life because he's of age
exactly,
now, and so yeah, I get
exactly.
that. I get that. Yeah.
And about a year before she died, she wrote me a 10-page letter, which I still keep, and it's pristine like the day she
Mm,
wrote it, about how far I had fallen away from God and how my life had changed so much because I'm not putting God first in my life. And that was because I was starting to explore who I was. Obviously, not telling her that I was gay, but I had a gay housemate and I had a group of friends, etc. And, mothers being mothers, they have this inclination. But the day she died, the very next day, I felt it wasn't like I was waiting for her to die. I couldn't tell her because I know my mother. I knew my mother, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her because she was already dying of cancer, and this would be the last thing she wanted to hear before she died, like a massive disappointment. So I went like, why put her through all that torture when actually she's already suffering? And so the very next day after she died, so this is it. I have to be who I am now. So I wrote to I was living in London. My sister was in Canada. My dad was in Malaysia, and my brother was in Malaysia. I wrote to them all and just said, "This is who I am, and you have the freedom to choose to still know me and love me, or I will have to learn to let you go because you wouldn't want to accept me. So the choice is yours. But I have
right.
decided I'm actually going to live my life." And I was about 35, 36 years old at this stage. So
That's
pretty
interesting.
quite, so it's quite late in the day that
Yeah.
I've come out, right? And in the meantime, that the long-term relationship I was in also came to a very painful end. And I found myself trying to re-find myself again. Like finally, I'm open out and free, but at the same time, very lonely because the relationship has ended. The anchor of where I was, I thought who I was as a person had
Right.
ended, and suddenly
Well,
the world was a very lonely, open place.
I want to pause here for a second because
Yeah,
you've given us a lot of content and you've given us a lot of things to talk about as it pertains to multiple ceilings that you had to break, right, in order to be the real and authentic self that you mentioned before. And ironically, at a staff meeting this morning, one of the things I talked about is that our own self be true, right? You cannot be your best person. You cannot gain your personal achievements until you're true to yourself.
yeah,
And one thing that you said in early in your life, which we think this is just a Western world kind of thing, is the whole being ostracized because of mixed marriages, right?
yeah.
And we think that's a Western world thing. That's not. This is
Oh God,
unique
no.
to the Western world, and what we're seeing and what I'm hearing here and what the audience is taking away is that no, it's not. And we're similar ages. In the 70s when I was growing up, and when you saw a mixed kid, they were really mixed up
Yeah,
because they had no idea where they belong. Right.
yeah,
Am I black? Am I white? Am I Korean? Am I black? Because I grew up near a military base. So
yeah.
post Korean
Oh,
War. So we had a lot
yeah,
of black and Koreans
yeah,
mixed, and there was always confusion in the
yeah,
ranks. And again, if it's black and white, it was true ostracization within the white community toward that. It's changed a lot today, like you mentioned, but back then
yeah.
it was. I can see the parallels here, and I want the audience to understand that it is not just a Western thing.
No, not at
These
all.
type of activities and these type of pigeonholed and blocking out access to resources and things, and you mentioned about jobs, are real. And so there was multiple ceilings you went through during this time frame, right? And some were self-imposed, like we talked about before. You had some you self-imposed that, I don't want to be seen who I really am. So
Yeah,
I'm putting my own glass ceiling and stopping myself from moving forward. And it took a very heartbreaking, critical event in your life to make you realize that I must break this glass ceiling. I must
yeah,
be the best me, because being the best me is going to allow me not only to excel on a personal level, but it's also going to give me the freedom and the breath, if you will,
yeah,
to continue to move forward. So very interesting. So we're at the position where you made the decision with the family, and families are
yeah,
always hard to deal with, right?
yeah. 100%.
Yeah,
It
and
it was it
they
was a
can
struggle for
be,
the family.
yeah, they can be your number one cheerleader, and they also gonna be your worst enemy at the same time. And so
And
let's pick it back up from there. I think
yeah,
that is again, for the audience, this story, I'm sitting here and listening to it, and I got chills running down my spine, because of the fact of there are so many different aspects of ceilings you just had to achieve and pull yourself through, right?
yeah,
It wasn't a I'm just going to grind through. No, you literally had to pull yourself through the membranes of the glass, and
yes,
which is much more difficult than taking a hammer to it.
yeah.
Right. So,
That is 100% correct, David. And I do want to reiterate that it was the whole notion of ostracism and just um, cultural taboos, etc. It's not a Western world thing. I was, as I said, I was born and brought up in Asia, and it's prevalent. It was prevalent in the Indian community. It was prevalent in the Malay community. It was prevalent in the Chinese community. And I know friends who are of other mixed races around the world, not just in the Western world, in other parts of Asia, in other parts of Africa. Where it's exactly the same. So I think the
right,
problem is the same between cultures. It's not just a Western thing, but the notion of just being not authentically pure is the challenge, right? Pure
right,
seen as pure. Um, but yeah, picking up from the stories. So because I lacked a direction, what I doubled down on was my North Star was being the best at my job. It's the only thing I could hold on to. I couldn't hold on to uh, um, just my visual appearance, being a person of who's ethnically mixed. It was strange still at times in London. It wasn't overtly racist in many ways, but it was. I did feel awkward, like I was the very first person of color to be hired in the first PR agency I ever worked with, and there were about 100 of us. And I remember turning up the first Monday and looked around, thinking, "Oh my God, I'm the only person of color." And it's strange. I never thought that before,
yes,
right? But and
yes,
then suddenly you turn up and you walk into a company and you suddenly feel, oh my God, I'm an outsider. I'm really strange, because I don't relate to anyone. Um, but no one made me feel inferior, etc. In at least in that first experience. But in the years leading up to that, there were many. I remember a couple of at least two CEOs who referred to me, and I don't know whether you know this expression, but charwala. Charwala means tea boy in the Indian language, and it's normally a derogatory
um,
term. And they may have said it in jest. I remember being in the Waterloo station carrying up this pitch board, and I was a business development director. I was a director level person with about 12 years of experience under my belt. Um, and I'm in Waterloo Station, about to hop on a train to go and present to a client. And the CEO gets up and trudges to the train and claps his hand and says, "Come along, Charwala, carry the boards." And to him, he probably said it in
wow,
jest, but I was incredibly offended by that. But in polite society, what I did was I nodded and I laughed about it, just to ease the
is it
tense moment
attention?
away.
Yeah,
And for me today, that Suresh is not going to laugh. That Suresh will actually say something about that moment, because
right.
that's the moment to educate, right? So what I realized is I couldn't get into the I had already stumbled through my own life, and as you say, breaking every membrane of that glass ceiling. I was tired. I didn't have it in me for more battles, etc. And in that process, this was I lost my dad in 2011 to a heart attack, and then in 2015 got the opportunity to move to New York, and I was promoted. At this point, I'm, by God's grace, flying through my career. I'm doing really well because I had nothing else to live for. There's
Yeah.
nothing else in my life. I couldn't be who I was ethnically, sexually, or from an emotional point of view. So I was single on my own, and I threw myself into career. And what happens when you do something over and over again really well, you excel. So
Yeah.
that was my driver, and I didn't mean it. And now when I think about it, I didn't design it that way because I had nothing else going for me. So I had to throw myself into my career, and that pushed me ahead. And then I arrive in the US, and everybody told me, and I have naturalized as a British citizen, so I'm now British today, no longer Malaysian. And I moved to the US, and I'd spent 21 years in England. They said, you've lived in London all your life. You're now going to move to New York. You're just going to blend in because it's London's like New York and New York's like London. And the truth is, I can categorically tell you, David, it isn't. London and New York don't fit into each other. They're very different pace,
Yes,
very
they
different
are.
society, and life is very different. And the only briefing I remember, the chairman of the organization I was with, and I won't name any of the companies because there were challenges in each of those experiences, but the people were lovely. And the chairman who moved me over said to me, the only briefing I received is, not, make sure this is your job description, Suresh, or this is your program. There was no job description. The only briefing I received was, Suresh, sharpen your elbows. And I didn't know what it meant. I genuinely didn't know what it meant. I wasn't used to that expression. And then when I came here, I realized the corporate environment is incredibly aggressive, very, very aggressive in the US. And I've never been in
Yes.
that environment because polite English society, everybody, toots and raises their eyebrow when somebody cuts the queue on the underground. But here, people will mouth off, and I'm not used to that, right? And I
Right.
come from polite British. I'm not saying that it's impolite here, but like polite British society where people queue and everybody says please and thank yous. Well, here it's much more brazen. Like you say it like it is, you address it, and actually, in a way, it's actually pretty good because you know exactly where you stand with certain things in life.
Correct.
And so I came here and I just assume I'm going to sit down and acclimatize and just get on with my job and do what I do really well. Being worldwide chief growth officer at that point, I traveled tremendously globally and within the United States. And that's when I started to really feel an aspect that had never really fully realized. So I dealt with the sexuality thing. I've dealt with just the personal, racial, sort of ethnic upbringing in Asia. And then I come here and I realize many times I'm actually a victim of racism, particularly on flights, right? And up till now, David, I kid you not,
Yes.
I arrive at the airport 5 to 6 hours earlier every time because I know I'm going to get searched. I know I'm going to get pulled over. Despite all my TSA pre-check,
Yeah.
clear eye thingy. I have everything you think I should have. I have to clear my way through, but I still arrive 5 to 6 hours before because I always get pulled out. Oh, you're random search. I mean, of course I'm
Yeah.
random
Yeah.
search because I've been random for the last 24 years. Why would it change, right? And and so but one thing I realized, and I remember this moment, and I should add in this period, my sister, was married, and while she got divorced, she married a black man, and so my niece and nephew are part black, and visibly part black,
Right.
and what I realized is, and I come from again from the spectrum of being a ethnically diverse in terms of being Asian and being LGBTQ, so I understand that intersectionality. I had no understanding what it means to be a person who's black, and then I come to this country and I see a very visible difference in that. And it brought back all those memories of actually, it's not one nation, it's not one equal nation. There is
No.
different classes of society here as well. And I
Yes.
would experience that on the flights. And I remember one instant I was flying from New York to Minneapolis. And at my level, I was entitled to a first class flight, and I came in. I was the last person to board the first class. I came in, and the gentleman was already sat on by the window seat, and there were two seats on each side. Sat by the window seat, and he's buckled in, and he's reading a magazine. And he looked up, and I looked down and said, "Good morning." It was about an 8:30 morning flight. I said, "Good morning," and I was putting my luggage in the overhead. He looks up at me, doesn't respond to my morning wish, and he looks up at me, looks across the aisle on the other side, looks at me again, looks at the aisle again, and then he gets up, unbuckles himself, puts his magazine, unbuckles himself, shoves me aside. And I mean that literally shoves me aside and says to the lady on the other side of the aisle, say, "Would you mind if we swap seats?" And
Wow.
that then, he's a
Wow.
straight white man. And I went, wow, that was crystal clear. And the woman, and God bless her soul, and she realized the situation. And I didn't know how to react. I've never been in that situation before. I've had other instances of racism, but I've never been in a very blatantly, openly racist situation. She quickly unbuckles herself and gets over. And as she's walking past me to get to the window seat that was right by me, she put her hand on my shoulder and goes, "That's okay. Just ignore that moment." And in hindsight now, what I wish she had done was actually said something to the guy, because I needed an ally in that moment, because I felt very exposed and very
Very
alone, and I
long.
was
Yeah.
too shocked to say anything in that moment. So I just kept quiet, and I then sat down next to her, and she was a spitting image of Joan Rivers with the same sense of humor. So we ended up having a lovely flight, and she was very, very jovial, but. And God bless her soul for making that decision to switch over. But I would have loved an ally in that moment. And that was the light bulb moment, David, when I went, I can't sit down and take this, because I see it around me. I see it happen to my black friends. I see it happen to my Asian friends in the US, in the context of being in the US, and I
Yeah.
see it in my niece and nephew. And at this point, we're starting to see a lot more coverage around treatment of people of color,
Hmm.
etc. And I remember the moment the George Floyd story hit, and the first thought I had was my nephew. He's a young black man, and he was coming of age where he was going to get his driver's license. And the first thing I did is I picked up to the phone, and I'm going to get emotional when I say this, but I picked up the phone to my sister and I said, "Please don't get him a license. I don't want him to ever drive." And she knew, she was feeling it as well, and she fears for his life every day. And I've got a young black man, a young black woman in my family, and I remember thinking, I don't want him to face this at all, which means I don't want him on the road. And my sister said, we can't stop that, because he has to live. He has to,
Yeah.
at some point he needs a
Exactly.
job, and he
Yeah.
needs a driving license. So when I went back, they live in Pennsylvania. I went back to Pennsylvania, and I was living in New York. My first thing to him was, you know, when you get pulled over, I was talking about the car, was it when you get pulled over by the police? I didn't say if,
It's
I said,
when.
when you
Yeah.
get pulled over by the police, I said, the first thing I want you to do is when you enter the car before you start driving, is take your wallet out and put it on the dashboard, because I don't want you to reach for anything, because I want your hands on the wheel. So when they pull you over, you direct them, say, "Officer, my wallet is on the dashboard and my driving license is in it. Please help yourself." Because I don't want you to move your hands, because the moment you move your hands, you're a potential killer in their mind.
Yeah.
And I do not want that. And this is the briefing we're giving our teenagers as they start to embark on their lives. I, for me, this is beyond reproach.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to live for this. At the same time, as I'm thinking of this, is I've been in the Marcoms industry for 24 years. I see the dearth of talent we have coming in, because people who are ethnically diverse and minorities don't see this industry as any future for them, because why? It's very, very dominated by a very monochrome community. And trust
Correct.
me, a lot of these people are my closest friends, and they are amazing at what they do. But it's a very privileged life, because a lot of these people don't actually come through this walks of life to think about what their careers are going to be. So, and I'm being very blatant, because like for a lot of black people, they think, well, you're going to be a musician or an athlete, because that's what
That's what you
that's what
see.
media that's what you
That's what you
see,
see.
right?
Yeah. They
That's what
can't
you
be
see.
what
So
they
you
can't see. That's
exactly
exactly
that.
what you see.
That's what media shows out. That's what media sort of promotes, and that's what you think your line of work is. And I remember receiving a brief for a very, very big um, alcohol brand, and the brief actually stipulated same product had different messages for a Caucasian community a Latino community, and the Black community. And each of those key messages reaffirmed stereotypical thoughts of what the walk of life is. So for Caucasian community, it's all the high-end sporting events like equestrians and blah blah blah. Latinas was all the club scene, and the Black community was all the club and the hood scene. And I'm thinking, isn't that how can we even accept this brief? The brand is telling you what to think and say to these communities because that's what they want you to think. So, and that's when I go back to the upbringing of actually focusing on being the best that I am. So I said, I've got to start talking against this. I have a responsibility here. I have to do something about this. And that's when I started to pipe up. Like I went, stop, you've got to stop pigeonholing individuals because everybody has a potential. And if you give them the opportunity, they can actually be amazing at what they do. And that's what I am. And that's what I double down to actually focus on being, the best person that I can in my walk of life. And that has helped me to an extent break the ceiling. And I've got multiple ceilings above me, David. I haven't finished. I've got so many ceilings above me, but I'm cracking each one because I've doubled down on I've not focused on my ethnicity. I've not focused on my sexuality, but I focus on my ability. And through my ability, I'm going to actually use that to drive a stake through every ceiling that's above me.
Beautiful.
Sorry, I've rambled on so much.
No, yeah. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about the things you're saying, and comparatively, I'm looking through my life journey and the things you talked about, and the parallels are quite scary. And the reason they're quite scary is because there are things that exist that we can only see. Right. And the reason we can only see it is because we have been conditioned to see it. I've said this before, and people think the human culture is cerebral. Like we are cerebral beings. We're not. We are visual creatures. Our contextual view of the world is what we see.
Yep.
And we build those contextual views of the world based on what we see, and then we draw our own stories and conclusions based on what we see. That's why you see repetitive cycles in areas because that's all you see. So because that's all you see, you tend to become, versus realizing there's other things that should be seen and certain things should be brought forth. And, to kind of close here, I have with the Black driver story. My brother, he was a part of a very vicious ending to one of his best friends.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was my brother, a good friend of his best friend, and my best friend from high school.
Wow.
They were driving down a highway in Georgia. They were pulled over on the highway by the sheriff. The sheriffs came out with guns drawn. Walked up to the car, get out of the car, keep your hands where I can see it, get on the ground, get out. My brother gets out the car. Now, mind you, my brother is 6'3". His good friend in the front seat is 6'5". My best friend, which was sitting behind him, is 6'2". My brother's best friend is 6'4". So we're very large Black men are in this vehicle, right?
Yeah.
So as my friend gets out and goes to the ground, my brother's best friend is reaching for the seatbelt to take the seatbelt off so he can get out the car. They hear a bang. My brother's best friend brains was blown in his vehicle and he fell out the vehicle to his death. And I tell this story because I'm very reserved with this story, because people don't believe it actually happens, and there are multiple degrees of separation. There is no degrees of separation in this.
No, not at all.
And it happens. Things like that do happen. It's not fake news when it happens. But conversely, we've got to show that The color of my skin is not your enemy. I can be your ally on so many fronts.
Yeah.
And our lives are so parallel.
Yeah.
You just brought up a whole different infrastructure that you came up in from a whole different world. And it's not much different.
Yeah.
And to my audience here, I'm sitting here with chills as I listen to Suresh's story. And the reason I have chills is because he grew up in a whole nother continent than I did, and had multiple glass ceilings that he had to conquer and literally pull himself through. I still am a victim of those glass ceilings today. Eric said it well, there are scars, maybe there are superpowers. I don't know. But we have to be mindful. We have to be diligent, and we have to be fair. It only takes one to make a change.
100%.
Be that one, and you won't believe what we can do. Suresh, my friend, I want to thank you so much for joining me. This has
Thank you,
been
David.
very spiritual for me. I'm getting a little choked up
Likewise.
here, and I'm trying not to.
Likewise.
But I do appreciate you, and I appreciate you being so candid with your story, my friend. I think it says a lot, and you've been through a lot, and you still smile, and that's the beauty of it all.
That's all we can do, David. If we don't do that, it'll be a very sad world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And to my audience, I appreciate you, and thank you for sticking around through this one. This is one of the ones that I'm really going to be talking about for a long time. Suresh, I appreciate you. We do have another one coming up. I'm going to take a breath here for a minute, but thank you all for joining me, and thank you for joining the ride. Appreciate you.